Alright, so here's the thing. How many of you have been on the right place at the wrong time? What do I mean with that? Well, imagine yourself, you're traveling and you have a tight itinerary, right? So you don't have time to go to the perfect spot at sunset because you're traveling with people and they just want to keep going. So you're ending up in this really beautiful place at a time when the weather, for instance, is just crap, such as I had the case last week when I went to Belfast. I was at this beautiful place, this place right here, and I had no sunset, I had no sunrise, it was overcast, the color was dim, everything was just nah. So today, at the end of this video, or even just in a couple of moments, you're gonna be like, what? Because I'm going to show you what you can do with these images and how you can transform them from a plain landscape image to a really extraordinary, perfectly awesome sunset in Photoshop in no time whatsoever. So let's run that intro and then jump into Photoshop and get going with creating some magical landscape. Now, before we jump into Photoshop, it's actually important to understand how I got the image which we're going to use in Photoshop. Because what I did, I took 3 images, one where you could see the sky very well, one where you can see the landscape very well, like the foreground, and one which is sort of in between. And later in the post-processing, you can combine these 3 images to get one evenly exposed image. Now, you can use different techniques to bring these 3 images together. You can use third-party software, so not Photoshop if you don't want to. You can use something like Photomatix. It's a dedicated HDR software, and HDR stands for High Dynamic Range, and that's exactly what we're doing. We're taking this high dynamic range and putting it all in one image, right? It's awesome. It's a really cool technique. Check it out if you have not heard about it before. Now, as I said, you can use Photomatix. Aurora HDR is another dedicated software that does only that. It combines images into one. Or you can even do it in Photoshop itself using a technique that is called exposure blending. I'm going to link something down there in the description from a guy called Jimmy McIntyre, who's really good at explaining how exposure blending works in Photoshop. Now, for me, because I'm a quite lazy person, I like to just take these 3 images, throw them in a software that calculates for me which parts need to be taken from one image and which parts need to be taken from the different image, and then puts it together nicely for me so that I can work with that. And I'm using one that is called Aurora HDR. And before we jump into Photoshop, I'm just going to show you how Aurora HDR can work for you if you want to. I'm not affiliated with these guys. I just really like the software because I kind of dig the automation of the process. Now I have my 3 images here, and you can see if I just drag and drop them into the software Aurora HDR, you can see that it automatically identifies the one that is underexposed, where you can see the sky very well, the sort of in-between shot, and then the one where you can see the foreground extremely well because it's really, really bright. Now, if you have a handheld shot, just hit the little alignment button in the lower left-hand corner and click the Create HDR button. Now, Aurora is going to think for a good minute because it's actually kind of good in aligning the images and, doing all the pre-calculations, I assume. And I'll bring you back once it has completed that task. And here we go. So once Aurora HDR has finished thinking about the whole thing, then what you end up with is an image where you can see the sky great, where you can see the foreground great, and everything in between as well. So that's exactly what we need. Now, the only thing left for us is to decide how strong we want to have different effects, and depending on how you download that software, if you wanted to, you would have hundreds of presets down here, which would all give you a little preview, and you can kind of choose what you want and then go into the single adjustments and go from there to, tweak it in any way you feel like. Now for me, because I like to do the main or the most part in Photoshop itself, I mostly go for something that is called realistic, and once you click on it, it's going to process that and going to show you what it looks like if the image was to be exported. And I like it, even though it's completely oversaturated, but at least I can see everything is nicely exposed for my purposes, and I don't actually worry about anything else because I can always do that later in Photoshop. Now, so let's export that baby and bring it over to Photoshop and get going with that. So let's get going with Photoshop. Now, what I'm going to do is, it's kind of a 3-step plan, right? First, I'm going to take the clouds and I'm going to make it look like they're moving by just blurring them into a certain direction, right? And it's kind of a picture is kind of perfect for that. Then we're going to insert the light source in our image just on the right-hand side right here. And then we're going to make sure that the darkness is really surrounding all the landscape, and just the brightest part will be the actual light source that we put in. So let's get going with that sky and make it a little bit blurry. Now for that, if we zoom in a little bit, we can see that there's actually a nice separation between the sky itself and everything else, right? So the water and the stones and the landscape back here, everything is nicely separated, which is good because then I can save myself some work and I can just quickly go to the left-hand side and choose the quick selection tool, which I then choose to just select that sky, just like that. So let's zoom out and select the rest of that sky, just going over and see if it did it. And I think it did actually a good job. So it has just selected currently the sky. Now, what I want to do with that, I want to bring the sky onto a new layer. So with my selection, I'm going to go to Command and J on my keyboard to duplicate only what I had selected before. So now I have my sky on a separate layer, which is exactly awesome and exactly what I wanted. Now, having said that, there's one more problem, which is that I need to put that sky a little bit further down because we're going to blur it from here towards the top left sort of, right, in a kind of circular fashion. And that means if it takes the sort of bottom part of the sky and blurs it into this direction, we're going to have an area which is sort of exposed and blank at the bottom. So we're going to need that sky to be just a little bit lower, but behind the actual landscape. It's all probably very confusing, but if you bear with me for a moment, you're going to totally understand what I'm talking about. So we're going to have to find a way to get that sky and bring it further down behind that landscape. And in fact, it's actually easier than you think. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold my Command key on my keyboard and I'm going to click on the sky that we had just created, essentially reselecting it, right? So you can see there's a little selection mark. And with that, I'm going to click on the layer mask symbol just to create a layer mask. Now, obviously the layer mask is tied to the layer, right? So you can see that where the layer mask is black, the layer with the sky is not being shown. So that is actually perfect because now we can sort of disconnect the actual sky from the layer mask, choose the sky, hit the V button on our keyboard, which is the move tool, and then just push the downward arrow keys on our keyboard to bring down the sky. And you see, if I move that sky back and forth, I can also use my mouse if I want to. I can now independently move the sky from the actual rest of the landscape, which is really, really cool. I like that. So let's zoom out a little bit, and we don't need much. We just need to bring it down a little bit to maybe something like that. And because it's also we are able to also transform the image, I'm going to just take the top part and move it and pull it back to fill the top part of our image. Once I'm happy, I'm going to hit the OK button and it's going to do exactly that. So if we switch it on and off, we can see we just have pulled the sky a little bit further out, which is kind of cool because that's exactly what we need. Now, with that sky selected, still the same sky, I'm going to go to the top to Filter. And here I'm going to go to blur, and I always mistake these two. Is it the motion? I think it's the radial blur. Yes, it is. Now here we have the option to zoom, which I want, and I also want an amount of approximately 10, so something like that. And you have to be careful where you place the center, so there might be some try and error. I want the center of my blur to originate where I'm going to put the sun layer, and I'm going to blur the whole thing outwards. So I have placed my center here because I know it's going to work. So let's hit the OK button. And let's wait until the blur has come to pass. Here we go. So what it does now, it takes the center from here and it's going to blur the whole thing outwards in sort of a radial fashion, right? And it gives just the impression as to us having used a long exposure to capture the movement of the clouds, okay? So you can do this in a couple of more professional ways if you feel like as well. But I kind of really like that because it also, when you look at it, especially when you look at it drunk, it really looks like the clouds are moving, which is kind of cool. Now, that is the first step. We have our clouds done. The next part is just to get that sun right here in the lower part of that image. So for that, we'll need a separate layer first. So I'm going to hit on my keyboard the key combination Command or Control if you're on the Windows, Alt, Shift and E to put all the information that we have generated onto a separate layer, right? So now I have a separate layer. Now with that, I want to go to the top to Filter, down to Render, and down to Lighting Effects. And lighting effects lets us place a sun in our image, which is super, super cool. So let us think for a second. And yeah, here we are. Perfect. So now we have a bit of a sun here, right? And you have different kind of options you can choose here. Just if you want to go for something like me, just copy these options over and then you can move your light source around as to wherever you feel like it should be. I'm going to leave it here because I kind of know it works well with this image. Cool. So I have an orange color, so the light which is kind of being dragged outward from that light source is orange. And yeah, you can see the other settings here. They're not too important. I would suggest to play around with them until you find something that works for your image. Let's hit the OK button. And soon enough, we'll have our light source in the image. And it's really quick, really easy to do that. So the next step is that we need to darken down the whole image, because that's a sunset, but it's bright as hell. So for that, you have different opportunities. What opportunities? You have different possibilities, and you can either use the curve adjustments or the level adjustments, whatever you feel like. I'm normally using curve adjustment layers. So I'm just going to take a curve adjustment layer and bring it down. I'm going to bring it down first for the foreground. So I'm going to bring it down to something like that. I'm going to hit Command and I on my keyboard, or Control and I if you're on the Windows. And now I can use a white brush to bring that darkness out in areas where I feel like it's needed. And I mean, it's going to be a sunset with a light there. So this side here would obviously be a little bit darker, right? So I'm just going to bring that darkness out and bring you guys back once I'm done. And here we go. So now we have a nicely darkened down foreground. It's not quite dark enough, but it's a good starting point for us. So if I switch it back on and off, you'll see that it looks already way better. Now we have to take care of our sky, and I kind of always go back and forth between foreground and the sky just to make sure I adapt one to the other as well, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the exact same thing. Hit a curve adjustment layer and just pull it down to something like, maybe something like that. I'm going to hit Command and I on the keyboard, and now I'm going to use a white brush just to brush that darkened down sky in areas where I want it. And I'm not going to touch the sunset itself because, well, that's the light source, so I don't really want this to be too dark, but just all the surrounding parts, just like that. If we need it darker, we can always bring it down further a little bit later, if that's what we want to do. Now, in my personal opinion, I'm always a bit more of on the colorful side, if you want. So I'm going to add some color to the sky, which is like a red or an orange or blue or whatever. So let's just go and do that. For that, I'm going to create a new layer by hitting Command or Control, Alt, Shift, and N on the keyboard. Once I have that, I'm going to hit the G button for grade and fill that new layer with a color of my personal choice. Now, in this case, I'm going to go for like a big, nice orange. Bam. Once I have that, I'm going to go to the blend modes and change the blend mode of that color layer either to soft light or overlay. So that really depends a little bit on your personal preference. We're going to try soft light, and if it's not strong enough, we can always switch it back to the overlay later. So that makes the whole thing a bit more transparent, and the color applies to all the areas in the image, which is not exactly what we need. But that's totally cool because we can always work on this a little bit more at a later stage some point. Now do keep in mind that with this way you can add more than one color. You can add a bit more yellow, you can add a bit more orange, you can add even a little bit more blue or purple, whatever you feel like. This is your playground. Like, throw in the colors until you think it's really cool, colorful and pretty. That's completely up to you in that sense. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to change that color probably already now a little bit. So normally I like to have one of these color layers being accompanied by a hue saturation layer. So let's click on that and attach it to our color layer, right? So now we clipped it to the color layer, meaning that any adjustment I do, if we zoom out a little bit, if I do any adjustment, it'll only change this particular color layer, all right? That's actually kind of cool. I like that already. Anyway, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag that a little bit towards the left here to something like in the more reddish area, to something like that potentially. And once I have done that, now I have to make sure that the whole thing is not visible everywhere, right? Because now obviously I have a super orange foreground as well, which is not really what I'm looking for. Now, again, different ways to skin the cat here. So I'm going to click on my color layer. I'm going to add a curve adjustment. And with the gradient tool, which you can find at the same place where the bucket tool is right here, I'm going to hide certain parts of that colorful orange layer. So let's go ahead with that. Choose a black as the foreground color and just drag it up just like that. And probably I should increase my opacity from 30 to something like 60. Okay, something like that. Oh, awesome. I have the radius tool activated. No wonder that it doesn't work. Let's try that again. Yeah, way better. Okay, just something like that. If you have the feeling you need it back a little bit, that's totally cool. I'm just going to do it and bring it back a tiny bit in the areas down here, because I think the orange actually works quite well in the foreground as well, if it's not too strong. Now, if we still don't think it's enough, we can always zoom in, take a black brush, and start removing certain parts from that orange from areas where we think it's super strong, such as these stones back here. Oh my Jesus, that's just far too much. I actually can't live with that at all. So I'm going to take a couple of minutes right here just to take the orange out of certain areas, and I'm going to bring you back once I am done. Alright, so I've just taken out a little bit of this orange tone from the stones in the back there, and I think I'm actually quite happy. Now, you're still wondering, like, well, it doesn't look anything like a sunset, the colors are dull. Well, here's the thing. Let's choose a curve adjustment layer, And let's just bring that curve adjustment down to something like that. And if you just look at the colors in the sky, you'll see how they intensify once I bring it down like that. Well, that's exactly what I was looking for. So I'm just going to drag it to something like that. I'm going to hit the Command L Control and I button to invert and hide the effect. And now with a white brush and an opacity of say 20% or something like that, I'm going to start to bring this super strong color now through around the sunset. Not everywhere, just really around the sunset, because I'm going to have to darken it down and probably take some color out also of the surrounding clouds, because it's too red right now, right? But I do like this kind of really strong colors in the surrounding here, just like that, and maybe also here a bit more. That's awesome. I really dig these kind of colors. I think it's really cool, but obviously that's something you can definitely play with and decide for yourself completely how strong you like these kind of things. Now, I also want to have a look and see if we want to darken down the foreground right now a little bit. And maybe that's not a bad idea to just do it a bit here on the grass side as well. So let's choose an opacity of 20%. Maybe zoom in there a little bit, that makes a bit more sense as well. And just darken down that stuff here that is super distracting. I don't really like that. Let's get rid of this just by putting that through. Okay, cool. So we're already getting a bit closer. Let's also darken it down here a little bit. We're already getting closer to what we actually want, which is a super cool sunset and a really actually kind of nice foreground with fresh and hot colors. Awesome. So I'm just darkening down the bit stuff here as well, because why not? Because we can. Now, having said that I like intense colors at the very sort of sun there in the back end, I want to make sure that they fade out into a bluish color at the back here, right? And again, there are now many ways as to how to achieve that. So first of all, what we can try to do is take a bit of heat out by just going back to our color layer, double clicking on that layer, and just using the so-called blend if function to make sure that the red is actually only showing in the darker parts of the clouds. So for that, I can just hold my Alt key on the keyboard and just use half of this little slider and drag it towards the left, right? And doing this, if you hit the right moment, no, not the whole thing, just half of it. If we get the right moment, it should take a little bit of the super heat out of the image. I think something like that is not bad. I like that. Now, having done that, let's create another hue saturation layer, and it's just change the hue, especially in the reds. Let's go to those reddish colors, reds right here. Make sure we have selected the red in the sky. We have. So if you just crank that up, everything that goes crazy is something you have currently selected. And done. Now let's change that a little bit towards the left-hand side right here. Let's see if we want to go into a blue area. Where's our blue area? Here. It's a bit too purple, isn't it? Maybe let's stick with something like, actually that's not bad. I kind of dig that. Let's see if we can accept that by just going over to something like this. I think that's going to be kind of cool. So let's see how it looks if we paint it in. Command and I to hide the effect. And just drag it in with a 20% opacity. Just go ahead and bring that into the image on the left-hand side here. Do take your time with painting these things in, because it looks more natural if you actually have a flow activated and all this kind of stuff. But I'm just going to hurry at this point because I don't want to spend too long on that. So I think actually that's not a bad thing, and the color is kind of nice. And again, you can always go ahead and change this kind of stuff later if that's something you feel like to do. But for me, I think I'm actually quite happy like that. So now the heat is really concentrated just in the one part of the image, which is obviously the sun, and the rest is fading out towards, less intense colors, which are also going a bit more into the purple area. You can put it into the blue area, whatever you feel like. But I think for now, the next part we want to take care is the actual foreground and adapt that to the rest of our image. Now, the way to do that is quite simple. I'm going to first apply a little bit of an Orton effect. So it's going to, you're going to see it's going to be super cool. And then I'm going to darken down the whole image, and we're going to be actually done with that. So let's go and create an Orton effect. And an Orton effect in some way it's cool because it's kind of it gives a dreamy feeling to your image. So I'm going to create another stamp visible by hitting Command or Control, Alt, Shift and E on my keyboard. Now I have a separate layer. With that, I'm going to change the blend mode over to soft light. Go to Filter, Blur and Gaussian Blur. So get the Gaussian blur. So once I'm here, depending on the radius, you can see your image does different things. If you choose a super high radius, the image becomes kind of smoothed out. If you go somewhere a little bit lower, you get intensified colors like crazy, and also a little bit of more of an overall contrast in there, which is something many people do like. So for me, I'm gonna go maybe with something like that. I like this kind of dreamy effect in the foreground I have here, and I'm gonna hit the OK button. Now, if we switch it back on and off, or off and on rather, you can see the effect is super strong, and that is something where you definitely have to decide how strong you want to go with that. So for me, I'm just going to take a couple of areas by hitting Command and no, we don't hit it here. We're going to create a layer mask, and we're going to hit Command and I, and now use a white brush to paint that in wherever I feel like. So I do like it here in these kind of, I don't even know, whatever grass kind of you are. That's totally fine. I'll make it a bit more dark here. And I'm going to paint it in a little bit in the surrounding here, just a notch with 20%, just like that. So if I switch it back off and on now, you see it is a subtle effect, but one that I definitely like. And you kind of have to decide how far you want to go with that. Awesome. So last but not least, let's get another curve adjustment layer, darken it down to something like potentially that. Okay. And what I'll do now, I'm going to hit the G button on my keyboard to get my gradient tool. I switch over to the, how is it called, the radial gradient, okay? And I'm going to drag with a black foreground color and 100% opacity from the sun towards the outer part of our image, okay? Then I'm going to hit Command and I to invert that. And now we have a bit more, what would you say, a bit more darkness, especially in the surrounding parts of the image, right? No, actually the other way around. We have to hit Command and I, like that. So now we have a bit more darker edge, just like that, which kind of puts the attention on the sunset right here. And of course, you don't have to stop there. You can continue like I did in my original processing to add more colors or whatever, but that is completely up to you. And now you don't have to stop there. So when it comes to finishing these kind of images, it's always a bit tricky. So personally, I would probably desaturate a couple of areas in the image, but just for demonstration purposes, I think that's good enough to give you a good head start that you can try doing the same thing, taking a boring scenery where you were just at the right place at the wrong time and creating some awesome magical landscape image out of it by creating your own sunset. And everything else is really up to your own taste. The colors you use, how dark you make it, the contrast you have. You can go from there and just, extrapolate and create some awesomeness. Now, if you do let me know. Show me your images. Why not? Put them over in the blog, put them in as an attachment. I want to see this kind of stuff. Now, if you liked the video, do not forget to hit the thumbs up button. And also, if you're new, don't forget to subscribe, as it's going to help me out a lot. And other than that, you have a good one, and I shall see you the next time for processing vlog, whatever it might be. Have a good one, guys. Bye!